Hello, this is a presentation of solid oxide fuel cells by Deyanch Saparov, Andrew Brown, Samuel Davis, Talal Alzainat, Fang Zhaoyang for EGE 304 Heat and Mass Transfer course. Course instructor is Dr. Hall. This slide is going to be an overview of solid oxide fuel cells, or for short SOFCs. According to Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy Steven Winberg, SOFCs are electrochemical devices that convert the chemical energy of a fuel and oxidant directly into electrical energy. They are unique in that they produce electricity through an electrochemical reaction and not through a combustion process. So, as we can be seen from this, it can be assumed already that solid oxide fuel cells are typically more sustainable compared to other uh, combustion types of fuel generations. Um, the need for newer energy generation systems has been growing in the United States and the other countries, as the planet facing an unprecedented global climate change issues. Now, more than ever, cleaner fuel technologies are researched and developed. SOFCs compared to combustion type of fuel is much cleaner. The energy efficiency from SOFC can reach up to 80 to 85%, which is relatively high if you think about it. The combustion engine has a fuel efficiency of 30 to 35%, and yet it produces large tons of carbon dioxide. Based on these, it can be said that SOFC are looking like a great alternative. You can check Figure 1, where it shows an estimated projection of development of SOFC in many regions of the planet. Today, however, we will talk about Bloom Energy's 28 megawatt deployment of fuel cell technology to power South Korea historic cities. A picture of SOFC stacks can be viewed in Figure 2. Now, moving on to our next slide for introduction. For this presentation, each of the members will discuss several aspects involving the Bloom Energy's SOFC. The elements will include such as heat and mass transfer components, site assessment, and sustainability consideration. So a quick overview into SOFC and why it's better than combustion types fuels. SOFC use a hard, non-porous ceramic compound as electrolyte. Typically, about 8 mol% of yttria stabilized zirconia is being used. One of the key components of this type of technology is that it operates at 500 to 1000 degrees Celsius. It is both an upside and downside, and this will be discussed in the next slide. Also to mention that it has fuel flexibility compared to other fuel cells, which makes it more interesting. SOFC have two designs, planar and tubular. For the Bloom Energy's solid oxide fuel cells, the planar is used, and it will be more elaborated in the next slides. Planar design has advantages and disadvantages. It is one of the designs that developers are looking more into, particularly because it offers much higher volumetric power density compared to the tubular design. In addition, in planar design, high potential for lower cost. If there's a high potential for lower cost if the majority of the stack can be made of metallic rather than ceramic components, which can be attractive to investors that are looking to invest into one. Now, to talk about the downsides, the planar design of solid oxide fuel cell has lower durability and low reliability compared to a tubular design, which has a slightly higher. One of the reasons that these cons affect the design is due to the issue with corrosion of the components. SOFCs, as mentioned before, operate at 500 to 1000 degrees Celsius. So, of course, one would need to think about the thermal properties, and this will be discussed in the heat and mass transfer section of the presentation.
Now on to site analysis. The information pertaining to the site that we will be discussing is it is located in Hwaseong, South Korea, which is in the northwest of the country, and it was built by both Bloom Energy and SK Engineering and Construction. SK being a local engineering and construction company. Bloom Energy is an American company that specializes in this sort of technology, and the capacity of this plant specifically is 19.8 megawatts, and Bloom Energy's claim to fame is using solid oxide fuel cell technology that is scalable and um, space efficient. So as we can see from this photo, that seems to be the case. This is their proprietary technology, and this is actually their first power server in South Korea. The marketing term for them is power server. It is a solid oxide fuel cell plant, and it's the first one uh, of this kind in South Korea. The specifications of this facility is that it powers 61,000 local homes, and the total cost of the project is $126 million. The power system supplies natural gas as well to its customers, and not only to the city of Hwaseong, but also to rural residents. And it produces less CO2 than a typical power plant. Natural gas, oil, coal, or less CO2. But it is not a non-zero number. It does produce CO2, but it's very little, which is one of the benefits over traditional power generation. And another benefit is that it has very high efficiency due to it reusing the heat that is generated from normal operation, which helps reduce the fuel that is actually used, and it is more sustainable, 60% less CO2 specifically, and the technology specifically provided by Bloom Energy, which is their proprietary technology, is that it is scalable and it's space efficient. However, do be careful from this photo. It is provided by Bloom Energy, so be wary of marketing terms such as reliable and resilient.
Next, we'll move on to heat transfer. And before, the first thing we need to look at is the heat generation within the module. There's two different reactions, the oxygen reduction reaction in the cathode and the anode reaction, which is hydrogen oxidation. One is endothermic and the other is exothermic. The hydrogen oxidation heat production is governed by the electrochemical reaction rate and the entropy. There's also activation polarization in both the anode and the cathode, which is basically the shift in activation energy of the rate determining step in a redox reaction due to the presence of an electrical current. And this is also exothermic. In figure 5, we can see the temperature profiles for different components in the module. As you can see, the fuel enters on the left side of the graph, and it rapidly increases in temperature to 715 degrees Celsius, and then slowly increases until it gets to about the middle of the module, and then decreases in temperature as it's exiting the module. The air enters from the right and follows a similar trend to the fuel, but in reverse because it's entering from the other side. You can also see the profiles of the cell and the interconnect, and those, as you can see, are at a more constant temperature than the fuel and the air. This figure is from a group of researchers at the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, and they studied a case where the fuel utilization was 80% and the air utilization was 20%. Next, we can move on to the heat transfer. Now that we've seen the generation of the heat. And there are three major components to the heat transfer. There's heat loss by the conduction through the outside of the module. Also gaseous convection inside the porous electrodes, and internal force convection through the gas channels. Figure 6 is an important diagram to understand how everything is happening in the cell and module. As you can see, the air is entering from one side and the fuel is entering from the other side. And you can also see where the reactions are taking place and the oxygen ion flux through the module. Overall, the only heat loss is through the outside of the module, and there's usually little to no heat input because the hot air exiting the module is used to preheat the fuel that is going in. And now we'll move on to the mass transfer in the system.
So let's talk about the mass transfer system in the solid oxide fuel cells. Since this is a classic electrochemical system, we can easily apply the nearest Planck equation we learned in the lesson 9 to this system. Nearest Planck equation is an extension of Fick's loss diffusion equation, which is being used to describe the motion of a charged chemical species in a fluid medium. This equation includes a lot of parameters about the field, like the concentration, the electrical potential, the velocity, and the charge numbers. But unfortunately, the flow speed and electrical potential data of the field are not available in any of the sources we can find about the Bloom energy system. So we cannot really give a clear number and calculate the exact data for the Bloom Energy company's system in Korea. But there are still some specs we can get about it. First, most of the SOFC and battery using 8 mole percent of Y2O3 stabilized ZrO2, which has a charge number of 4, and its best operation temperature is going to be around 1000 degrees Celsius. So that's some of the parameters we can see in the equation. However, the systems are not going to maintain such a high temperature, since the extreme temperature will make the diffusion between the substances too violent, mixing the anecdote, electrolyte, and candidate and the fuels together, and which is a really serious problem that can even cause an explosion inside the battery. So for safety, the temperature is usually controlled between 500 to 1000 degrees Celsius, and actually in the real world it doesn't really exceed 900 degrees. Finally, there are a few minor design details being applied on the SOFC battery for the better mass and electrical transfer efficiency. We can see here the interconnect panel between each layer of cells have a special shape designed to enlarge and control the flow speed of the fuel and air. There are also special membranes between the anodes, electrode, cathode, and fuels, so that only the electrons is being transferred through the layers, and it can minimize the unexpected diffusion between materials. The SOFC system today have a lot of very complicated and interesting design to maximize its efficiency, as we all know.
The solid oxide fuel cell is a more environmentally friendly way to harness energy than natural gas combustion. This is because the solid oxide fuel cell utilizes an electrochemical reaction rather than combustion to produce energy. Therefore, no nitrogen oxides or sulfur oxides are produced from solid oxide fuel cell generation. Solid oxide fuel cells can cut CO2 emissions in half compared to the current US electrical grid. It also uses significantly less water in the process. The US grid uses over 18,000 gallons of water per megawatt hour, whereas a solid oxide fuel cell from Bloom Energy uses just 0.51 gallons per megawatt hour. In addition, solid oxide fuel cells can be run on biogas or hydrogen. When running on biogas, solid oxide fuel cells are carbon neutral. When running on hydrogen, solid oxide fuel cells produce no carbon. Fuel cells also internally reform methane, allowing for typical fossil fuel impurities such as ammonia and chlorides to be present. Internal reforming is a heat absorbing process which helps cool the cell. This allows for less energy to spend on cooling the fuel cell and makes the process more efficient. The Bloom box emits 679 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. This is less than the US electrical grid, which produces 914 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. But however, it is much more than solar photovoltaic, which produces 134 pounds per megawatt hour. Therefore, solid oxide fuel cells are better for the planet than typical combustion sources, but are not comparable to renewables such as solar, wind, or hydropower. They do, however, produce reliable energy, which is needed for baseload generation. This makes them a good source of energy to replace combustion and help transition to renewable energy. A life cycle assessment is a study conducted to explore the environmental impacts of all stages of a process. This includes mining, manufacturing, transportation, lifespan, and waste disposal of a product. A life cycle assessment can be utilized to explore how different energy generation technologies impact our planet throughout their lifespan. In 2016, a group of Italian researchers conducted a life cycle assessment of solid oxide fuel cells to explore how this method of power generation compared to other electricity generation technology. They based their study on 5 major types of air pollutants produced by most forms of power generation. I've selected 3 categories of technologies to compare on this bar chart. Solar photovoltaics are represented in blue, the electric grid is represented in orange, and a 1 kilowatt solid oxide fuel cell planar stack is represented in gray. The bars are plotted on a log scale and in reverse order to best show the data. This means that the larger a bar is, the less pollutants this source produced. Therefore, it can be thought of that larger bars are more environmentally friendly technology. As seen in the graph, solar photovoltaics are the best technology in every category. A 1 kilowatt solid oxide fuel cell planar stack performs better in 3 categories, but worse in 2 than the electric grid. The categories shown are acidification potential, eutrophication potential, global warming potential, photochemical oxidation potential, and ozone layer depletion. These are measured in kilograms of pollutant equivalent per kilowatt hour. Equivalent values are used since multiple pollutants affect each category. The first category is acidification potential, which is measured as the absorption of CO2, nitrogen oxide, and sulfur oxide into water. This is harmful to the environment because it increases the pH of water. This can cause oceans to acidify and damage underwater ecosystems. The solid oxide fuel cell produces 12% less sulfur oxide than the grid, but 30% more than solar photovoltaic. The second category is eutrophication potential, which is caused by phosphate being added to the environment. This adds excess nutrients to ecosystems and causes the overgrowth of plants and algae, which can harm the natural processes occurring in these ecosystems. The solid oxide fuel cell produces 64% less phosphate than the electric grid, but 48% more than solar. The third category is global warming potential. This is caused when greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, are released during the electricity generation process. These gases trap heat and cause temperatures in the atmosphere and ocean to increase, which has a negative impact on the biodiversity of life. The solid oxide fuel cell produces 35% less CO2 than the grid, but 80% more than solar. The fourth category is photochemical oxidation. This is caused by the release of volatile organic compounds into the air. These compounds form ozone in the troposphere and create summer smog. The solid oxide fuel cell produces 69% more ethylene than the grid and 85% more than solar. The last category is ozone layer depletion. This is caused by chlorine and bromine being released into the environment, which can destroy ozone molecules. The solid oxide fuel cell produces 23% more 1,4-dichlorobenzene than the grid, but 99% more than solar. According to this study, solid oxide fuel cells produce less pollutants than the electric grid in the first three categories. It does not, however, perform anywhere near solar PV. This study utilized a 1 kilowatt solid oxide fuel cell. In comparison, the newest Bloom boxes would be less environmentally harmful. In addition, they are almost 100% recyclable and reusable. The solid oxide fuel cell has the capability to achieve 7 of the 17 UN development goals. It directly impacts goals 7, 9, 11, and 13. This technology is becoming more affordable and provides cleaner energy than our current electric grid. It is a good alternative for baseload capacity and better than natural gas or coal. This technology is innovative and continually improving. Utilizing it for infrastructure can help build cleaner, more reliable electricity. In cities, solid oxide fuel cells can be used to create LEED buildings and self-sufficient communities. It also reduces air pollutants in these areas, which can increase the quality of life. The solid oxide fuel cell directly impacts climate change by reducing emissions and many pollutants produced by the combustion of fossil fuels. Solid oxide fuel cells can run on hydrogen and biogas, which are even more environmentally friendly and produce little to no carbon. This technology indirectly impacts goals 14 and 15. By decreasing emissions and pollutants, our electric grid can be cleaner and have fewer negative impacts on life on land and underwater. As seen in the system we explored, Bloom Energy and SK Engineering and Construction partnered to build the 19.8 megawatt installation. This is one example about how companies across the world form partnerships to help promote the UN Sustainable Development Goals and build a more sustainable future.
So in conclusion, solid oxide fuel cells are used at higher temperatures, which makes them more flexible with the type of fuel that they can use compared to other fuel cells. One of the challenges, as it was noted, is to match the components to meet the operable temperature and manage corrosion. There are many environmental benefits that solid oxide fuel cells can offer compared to combustion type of engines. And based on everything that was covered, there is a future for this type of technology. Thank you. Here are the references to the material that was used.